Hello everyone, I'm Daz and welcome to American Civil War and UK History. This presentation is available as a video on our YouTube channel or as a podcast from wherever you get your podcast from. And if you're watching on YouTube, remember to hit that subscribe button and give us a big thumbs up. And to keep up to date with everything American Civil War and UK History, check out our website where you'll find blog posts, podcasts and links to all of our social media pages. The link is available in the podcast description. And joining me today is the hosts of the Cloak and Dagger Podcast, Will Davis-Coleman and Patrick Courtney. Welcome, guys.
Thanks so much for having us. Great to see
you. Happy to be here.
And today's episode, we're going to be discussing a very interesting story about a Civil War soldier called Albert Cashier. Now, I came across a Instagram post on their fantastic Instagram page, and if you haven't followed their Instagram page, I would definitely recommend it. But before we get into that, guys, I always ask my guests for the first time, and I'll start with you, Will. How did you become interested in history?
Oh, now that is an age-old question, isn't it? I got into history through my dad. My dad took us to museums a lot when we were kids, and I just fell in love. And like many boys, maybe I fell in love at the National Army Museum with history, and that was my way in. Was military history, so it's good for this podcast. And then from there, it just built and built and built, and then I did a history degree at Manchester University and then a master's degree in it, and now I have a research company. So I've been in history my whole life. My career is history. So yeah, that's
nice. Thank you, Will. Okay, so please tell us, Patrick, how you got into history?
Well, I don't know if I have not as cool of a story, but honestly, I think probably, and I feel like a lot of people are like this, I probably got into history when I was a child because of the horrible history books. I loved those as a kid, and I would listen to. I think I'd listen to them. Like I had them on tape, and I would play with Lego or something and just listen to them endlessly. But then, to be honest, I did it in school, and I liked it a lot, and I did it at A level. But I was starting to wane on it a bit, and then I went to university and I did physics. But I went to university with this guy Will, and we were right next door to each other. And when I got really bored with my physics course, which does get very boring very quickly, I would just go across the hall and then just bug him and ask what he was learning about today. And then we would talk about history. And that's actually how this podcast kind of started. We just turned what we would do normally into a podcast medium. So I've been kind of brought back into the world of history in my later years. But it's so much fun. It's so interesting. I mean, I don't know why I'm explaining it to you. You're obviously into history as well.
Yeah, excellent. No, thank you for explaining. But yeah, no, we all love history. That's why we do it. But so, okay, let's talk about Albert Cashier. So let's talk about his early life, if you wouldn't mind, Will.
Yeah, of course. Albert Cashier was, unlike any other person that you might have come across in the time you've been listening to the US Civil War, was actually born as a biological woman, not as a man. So her name was I've just lost it. Jennie Hodgers, of course. And Jennie Hodgers was born in Clough in County Louth on Christmas Day 1843. And we don't know huge amounts about Albert. I'm going to call him Albert because it's easier. Otherwise, we're going to get very confused very quickly. But Albert didn't stick to one story about his upbringing. So we have this mixture of stories that he told his friends through the years and to a couple of government officials when he had dementia towards the end of his life. So you've got to kind of cobble it all together. And actually, whilst we were doing the research for this episode, my genealogy skills kicked in, and I headed over to Ancestry and to find my past. I started looking into Jennie Hodgers and the life of Jennie Hodgers. And from the small amount I could learn, Jennie was not an only child. She had 4 or 5, 6 siblings, depending on which census you look at. And so she had a father and a mother, but also a stepfather as well. So it's all quite lost in the midst of time. And I actually remember when we did our podcast episode on this, we struggled to get through to sort of fully understand the Irish start of this story, because this is where it all starts, in the middle of rural County Louth in Ireland. Mm-hmm. So Yeah, it's quite an interesting start. From the knowledge that we can glean, Albert was raised sometimes to wear boys' clothes, and this was partly to do with getting work. So girls tended to not be put into labour jobs until a bit older, so they would dress the girls as boys to bring in more income to the family. So this was quite common. This happened throughout, but can you imagine what that did possibly to confuse a child who, you know, in terms of biological sex compared to gender? It's kind of very interesting to see the way that by the time Albert becomes an adult, he has chosen to live as a man, but actually he was born as a girl. So quite an interesting confused picture at the beginning of this story. Mm-hmm. But yeah, have you got anything else to add, Patrick?
Yeah, well, I think it's really this is such an interesting story because it really focuses on stories from history that we don't hear about because of a complicated and maybe taboo upbringing or situation. And I think we get a lot of this with women's history, and I think trans history even to a far more degree as well. But these are stories that we don't learn about because they had to live their life a bit more hidden. They had to probably lie. We weren't shouting about their past in the way that cis white men tend to do in history, because they want a legacy and they want statues and everything. And that there's a class of people who throughout history have been able to write history and write the history about themselves. And so it's fascinating to try and learn as much as we can about the people who get lost to history, because in the times they live, their stories are not allowed to be told. And I think it's fascinating the fact that he has to hide so much to the point where at the end of his life, I wonder if he's not even quite sure what his origins are, because you just think of the number of lies you have to tell to hide your story through fear of persecution. So it's so nice that we can hear about this sort of story, but it leads to it puts an odd spin, because normally we like to learn so much about historical figures' childhood and past so we can understand where they get to. But we can't do that here. We almost have to learn about them in the future and apply that back to how their childhood may have gone.
Mm-hmm. And Will, can I just ask, what was a life like for people in Ireland at this point during the mid 1800s?
Well, that's a very horrible question. I mean, it wasn't very nice. Put simply, 1843, when Albert was born, was just 2 years before the Irish potato famine, or the Great Famine, started in Ireland. And this was one of the darkest chapters in Irish history, where the quickest way to say it is 1 million died and 1 million fled the famine. And the stat that I still can't believe to this day is that pre-famine Ireland had more people living in it than current day Ireland. That's how catastrophic this was for Ireland. And because he was born 2 years before that happened, it also adds to that picture of people dying everywhere, and all of that sort of trauma that was coming across the whole nation whilst everyone was dying. There was cannibalism in some parts of Ireland reported, where people were so desperate that they were eating the dead because that's all that there was. And I mean, not that we're going to go into it too much, but it was pretty avoidable because there was a lot of food being made in Ireland, but it was being exported to the British Empire. But all that was left was the potato crop, which was, because of the blight, completely non-existent. So it was very, very hard. In fact, it was one of the hardest times to be born into Ireland. Just like so many others, Albert's story heads across the Atlantic to America. We're not even sure when he actually gets there, but he was leaving an island that was ravaged by famine, caused partially by the British, who were exploiting the country.
Mm-hmm. And as you said, that make this voyage across to America, as many did, I mean, many Brits did the same thing. But again, like you said, a lot of Irish go, and I mean, there's all sorts of, Germans and Polish and lots of Europeans go to what they think is going to be a better life, don't they, in America? So tell us about what that voyage might have been like for Albert.
I imagine it must have been pretty terrifying because during the famine, also all education was basically suspended. So he would have been. We know that he was illiterate and probably couldn't read either. So limited education. Suddenly, he's on a ship. He's probably about 14, but it's hard to say. And he's going towards the complete unknown. So across the water, it wasn't a very fun trip. It wasn't like a sort of pleasure cruise. It would have been packed with other refugees who would have just paid just enough money to get over to America, the sort of promised land. And that's the thing. He would be going from a place of destitution to a sort of place which you've been told is a land paved with, the streets are paved with gold. And so that opportunity crossing would have been a very big mixture of emotions of, are we actually going to make it? Because crossing an ocean, I mean, trying to cross an ocean today, if you're in a boat, is still a huge undertaking. Try doing it in a leaking ship crossing the Atlantic in the 1850s or 60s. No, it's probably the 1850s that he's over there. So, yeah, not a very pleasant trip. He takes the trip, as far as we can tell, with his mother and his stepfather. His stepfather's surname is Cashier, as far as we can tell. Again, this is all depending on the sources, is all a bit hazy. This is just from what we hear later in Albert's life. And we think that's Cashier is where he got the name. It was from his stepfather. So, yeah, crammed, leaking, and storms, probably.
Mm-hmm. And correct me if I'm wrong, Will, but yeah, because I think one of his potential stories as well is that he suggests that he may have been a stowaway on the ship as well. That's right, isn't it? So, I mean, even worse condition if he's having to hide himself. He's got to hide from, I don't know, I was about to say the police. I don't know if they have police on boats. They have some sort of law enforcement, presumably on these ships, to stop all the immigrants getting rowdy. But, you know, even amongst all the others who are having a hard time of it, being a stowaway on a ship at this time would be even harder. And this kind of sets up his later life where, you know, he goes through some of the harshest times in history, but has this extra element to his life that makes it even harder in the fact that he has to hide who he is. And in this case, it's hiding the fact that he's a stowaway, but obviously will have to hide his entire being at some point as well.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so let's talk about when Albert arrives in America. This, like you said, it's paved with gold. It's going to be amazing. What I mean, I know you don't really know much about his early life in America, but what is it like for immigrants arriving, particularly Irish, in America at that time, Will?
Good question. And not particularly pleasant. Definitely not roads paved with gold. The Irish had a pretty bad reputation caused by British propaganda, amongst other things, and this is a quote from up until very recent history, and this is me in quotes, no blacks, no Irish, no dogs, was a sign that would be put in windows, because the Irish had this reputation of being, and this is an erroneous reputation, of being always drunk, very lazy, and violent, even subhuman. So today we have a very different impact. I mean, feelings about the Irish, of course, but that was the xenophobia around the Irish. Coming into America, there are actually lots of links with the African American community, because they again were treated as a lower class of citizen. So there's quite a lot of African American and Irish collaborations going on and relationships forming, especially in the melting pots of places like New York. The 5 Points district is probably where Albert would have ended up, which was this pretty difficult point at the bottom of Manhattan where there was just slums, essentially. So he would have moved into either a tenement or stayed with cousins who'd already crossed, because they would do that, and then they would try to find work, but the work over there was not pleasant. And to go from somewhere so rural as Cloahead and working possibly as a shepherd over there was quite a lot of shepherding going on there, to go from that to what we presume is very much an urban environment, all the dangers that come with that, especially if we don't know when Albert starts to wear men's clothes fully and come across as a man, but in a tightly packed space, and you want to keep your identity to yourself, that is difficult, very, very difficult. So yeah, that was kind of what it was like.
Patrick?
I mean, I don't know if I can add too much more because it's just I mean, we're building quite a harrowing picture of his life already. It's not going to get that much better, but I think it's a tricky time, and I think it's such an interesting tale because, as Will said, the fact that we don't know specifically when Albert makes this sort of transition, and it's probably in stages. And I think, I mean, a huge part of it, as we've said already, earlier in his life, there's a good chance he was dressed in boys' clothes to get work, and that may have been the case coming over to here, because obviously you've got this flood of immigrants all looking for work, all looking to survive, and obviously you need to be able to do that. And if he's got his parents with him, he needs to be able to look after them, and the money or the jobs that could be available for men will be far more plentiful at this time. Particularly, there, plenty of jobs for women as well, but easier to get a job as a man and get a decent wage to look after your presumably now elderly parents. Actually, I don't think we know how old his parents would be at this time, but it's important to kind of keep that family unit together in this huge city, and so being able to take care of his parents and get a job would have been crucial. So again, we see how circumstances are pushing him towards this life, and then that kind of builds this whole persona around him that we kind of look at as he builds his life in America.
Mm-hmm. Okay, now something huge is going to happen in America in 1861, and that is the American Civil War is going to start. And Albert is obviously, as you said, you don't know what happened in between, but he's there. But he doesn't actually enlist till September 1862, does he, Will? So tell us about his enlistment. And also, does he enlist in Illinois?
Well, yeah, he does. He enlists in Illinois. So, as a paper trail, this is the first bit where we can get a little bit of information, which is his enlistment. So he enlists, as you said, on the 4th of September, 1862, in Belvidere, Illinois. So at some point, he would have gone from New York to Illinois, which, again, lots of Irish immigrants did do. There was a big Irish wave of immigrants at that time. Now, Belvidere, not a very big place, and I think Patrick will agree with me here. We came to the conclusion that the reason why he didn't sign up when the first wave of enlistment happens in the outbreak of war is because he probably fears being caught as a woman under those clothes, because obviously to enlist most of the time, or it might have crossed his mind that you'd have to do a medical, which would involve stripping. Obviously, that would then completely rule him out for fighting. So that was kind of interesting. The other thing is that second wave of volunteers who sign on, they would have been. Can you imagine the pressure in those small communities where all these young men have gone off and you hear how terrible the fighting is, and then there are these other young men who haven't gone? The community would have, in the UK, when that happened, they'd be given white feathers to show cowardice. So there was a lot of pressure to go and join up. So if he was wearing his male attire and he was working but trying to stay under the radar, he suddenly realized he was looking like an odd one out, rather than blending into the background, because he was the only guy or one of the few guys who hadn't signed on yet. So signing up actually probably helped him keep his cover. But of course, can you imagine how nervous you'd be trying to enlist and worrying about that medical? But yeah, Patrick, do you want to talk about the medical? Do you remember?
Well, I was going to say something else, but I'll.
Oh, sorry, no. Don't worry, no, you say that. Don't worry.
Well, yeah, because I think there's a huge amount of part of his story around bravery, and I think you're right, and it's interesting to get into the head of this guy to understand where he's at this point, because while you're right, there's the pressure from the community about going off to war, but at this point, before he signs up, there's the battle of Shiloh, I think that's how you pronounce it, the battle of Shiloh, which is the bloodiest battle of the Civil War at this point. There's an estimated 23,000 casualties in total, which is a staggeringly large number of people to die this early in the war. So there's a certain element to his, you could see him as kind of getting pushed into it, and realizing that every able-bodied man is signing up, so he can't. It's almost like he can't pretend to be a man and not sign up at this point. But there's another side of it to realize how brave he is to go off to fight this war, as were all of the men going off to fight on both sides, having to sign up in this awful war that's taking place, especially as immigrants as well. He's new to this country, and yet he's willing to fight and die for the ideals of, well, one half of the country at least. But it's an extraordinary level of bravery that I think most of us nowadays would find it unfathomable in our very comfy lives we live now. So I think it's interesting to try and get in ahead about what side of it he's on. Is it bravery? Is it pressure? It's probably a bit of both. But it's fascinating to look at it that way.
Yeah, some great points, guys. Some great points. So he joins the 95th Illinois Company G as an infantryman. Does he go through some kind of training, Will?
Yeah, he does. He does get sent to training. Just to put in about the medical, they were just checking, as I'm sure you know very well, Daz, and everyone listening. They did very cursory checks because they were trying to get as many men to the front as possible, because this is the first proper, or one of the first properly mechanized wars. It just became a machine, as I'm sure your listeners are aware. So by the time these guys turned up, it was like, no, let's get you to training. So the training he had was actually quite long. Like, it wasn't as I was thinking, God, it's going to be a bit like World War I, where they would give them no time at all. But they were actually sent to Camp Fuller in Rockford, Illinois, for 2 months of training. So that's quite a lot of training, considering. And there he would have met his fellow G Company members, and the way that they would have trained in companies. So that's when the bonds of friendship are formed. And also, though, can you imagine, like, you hearing all of this horror coming from the South about all these deaths and these maimed bodies coming back, and you're there preparing to go down there to help those guys out? It must have been a hellish time, even in the training.
Mm-hmm. And I just want to add something myself there. So, yeah, at this point, obviously, he joins the Army of the Tennessee, which is under the command of Ulysses S. Grant. And at this point, as Patrick has already said, he fought at the battle. He didn't fight at the Battle of Shiloh. Sorry, the Battle of Shiloh had already taken place. The bloodiest day in American history for that so far, until we get to the next one, which is only a couple of weeks away by the time he signs up, which will be Antietam. But yeah, so there's and then you have Donaldson and Henry before that as well. So again, I can see, it must have been a scary thing to think about joining this army, and going and joining this war. But so Patrick, do you want to add anything about anything else there?
Well, we can comment on him as a soldier himself, actually, because it's really interesting, being obviously biologically female, and so not having gone through male puberty, having that spike in testosterone, as we all know about. So he's obviously lacking in height and strength, but this doesn't stop him from being a brilliant soldier, actually. So he's able to withstand long marches, and he's very clever, actually. He's able to help his fellow soldiers in ways that don't require brawn and height and everything. So he might help out around the camp, do some of the chores, and apparently he was also a fantastic shot, or just as good as everyone else, which is probably more important at this time of war, when it's all muskets and no more heavy armor and swords. So he's able to hold his own, as well as any other soldier, which I think is also crucial for him being able to remain under the radar for so long. You don't really want to doubt a soldier who's pulling his weight and is protecting you. And we'll probably build on this as this episode goes on, but you really start to see the bonds he makes with his fellow soldiers by being helpful and by being useful and by being reliable, which I think is probably the most important trait that soldiers can have when working together. You want to be able to trust the man in the foxhole with you. I don't know if they have foxholes in this time of
they warfare, will do later on. They will do. They'll learn those Napoleonic tactics. This don't work.
Well, there we go. So I think it's phenomenal to hear about his how he's able to adapt despite being presumably physically weaker and a bit smaller than most of his fellow soldiers.
Mm-hmm. And again, I would probably say that probably did him a favour when you're standing in the line of men getting shot at. But
Smaller target,
yeah. Now, he's going to join the Army of the Tennessee when they're going, or the start of the Vicksburg campaign. And this campaign goes on for months. I mean, this is huge. I mean, Grant tries everything he can to try and take Vicksburg from one side, then he has to go round. But anyway, he's involved in most of this, or all of this. But there's a few heroic and reckless deeds during this period, isn't there, Will?
There absolutely are. And I think just building on what Patrick was saying, that reliability was recognised by the officers of G Company in the 95th. And they would not constantly, he was a regular call-up for the reconnaissance patrols, which were incredibly dangerous if you think about it, because you're walking into enemy territory to basically work out where they are and report back, gather information, bring it back. And on one such patrol, he is ambushed, essentially, and is in the middle of a gunfight with the Confederate soldiers. And incredibly, he actually manages... So he's captured by these Confederate soldiers, and he manages to actually overpower a guard, steal his rifle, knocks the guy out, before making it back to friendly territory. And now that sounds a little bit like a tall tale, maybe, but there were other squad members who verified that fact later. So it did happen. And I think we talked about it in our episode. One of the reasons why he must have chosen to do that was, again, his actual sexuality, his biological gender would have been revealed as soon as the enemy took too close a look at him. And, he could have been, sexually assaulted or worse by being a woman and being caught, just like the female soldiers who dressed as men and went to war. It must have been on their mind the whole time, this secret that you have to get away from. So, yeah, it's kind of interesting. But, yeah, he was known. I think the way he did it was he sort of hid in plain sight by being as reckless basically possible. And he does a few other incredible, he has a couple of other lucky escapes. Do you want to talk about them, Patrick? Do you want to pick up where I am?
Yeah, there's a great story as well, which is, it really turns a bit of it on its head, because obviously in previous, that story that Will just told is him surviving and thriving despite his secret and despite his trying to think of a right way to say this, despite his biological differences to his fellows. But there's also an incident where he contracts diarrhea, which is very common at this time and a huge killer for, we have these, I was about to show because that photo of a big battle, but actually this is one of the biggest killers in this war, which is not great. But so he contracts diarrhea, and so he's placed in a field hospital. However, this is a huge risk to him, because if he's being examined by doctors, then they're going to discover who he really is almost immediately. He needs to be able to get away from this. So he applies, or just asks the doctor to be treated as an outpatient, which means he doesn't stay within the field hospital. He takes himself away. He does a lot of self-care. And this one keeps his secret safe, so he doesn't have to be examined by doctors. But it also may have saved his life, because it meant he wasn't near all of the other patients who could have had all sorts of diseases and illnesses that would have been spread around these field hospitals. People aren't really as clean as they should be at this time in history, so he may have had his life saved because of his secret, because he had decided to take himself away, which is a weird kind of ironic story as well. And very lucky, but there would many soldiers who don't have the secret who would have unwillingly gone to the field hospital hoping to survive and end up perishing because of a disease they caught there rather than catching a bullet.
Yeah, and I will say, over 600,000 people died during the American Civil War, and as Patrick alluded to, the majority of those people died of disease. Now, and again, it was rife in the camps. There was mites in the camp. There was all sorts of horrible things in the camps going around, diarrhea, all of that sort of cholera and everything you can think of, measles and anything you can think of. And it was a real horrible time for some people, But again, getting anything and then having to go to the hospital, and the fear that he must have felt of being discovered must have been horrible, but yeah, so and again, disease was the killer. It killed a lot of people. So he was involved in other campaigns after that, though, wasn't he? So he was in he went over to the Trans-Mississippi Theater and fought in the Red River campaign. So tell us about that, Will.
That was quite the campaign. It was not a very easy one. It ran from March to May 1864, and it was a terrible time for the Union. They were defeated in Louisiana, and there was thousands of dead and captured as a result. And just from Albert's perspective, to sort of narrow it down, the 95th was tasked with chasing down the Confederate cavalry leader Nathan Bedford Forrest, who later would become the first Grand Wizard of the KKK post-war. And he was nicknamed the Wizard of the Saddle, which, despite the KKK reference, is quite a cool name. If it was Gandalf, maybe. But no, anyway, and on this campaign, the 95th was being led by Sturgis, who was a general with not much experience. And they were involved in the Battle of Bryce's Crossroads, which was a huge defeat for the Union, where they were chasing the Confederates, and the Confederates turned around and ambushed them. And it was a very hot day, and loads of guys died from heat stroke before they even fired a shot. And the Union suffered over 2,000 killed and wounded and missing, compared with 500 on the Confederate side. And this actually led to the end of General Sturgis's war, and he was posted to less important positions. But for Albert, that must have been absolutely brutal, because you've just marched through people dropping like flies from heat stroke. You probably hadn't had much water. People are dying from cholera anyway, and then suddenly, not cholera, diarrhea, sorry, and then suddenly you're in a firefight with one of the more competent cavalry generals of the Confederacy, and you've just got to go, and you just got to fire, and to lose 2,000 men, I mean, that is just catastrophic. And it led to an influx of new waves of recruits to rebuild those battered and torn apart units.
Mm-hmm. Patrick, do you want to add anything there, mate?
Yeah, well, it's sad for Albert as well, and his unit and his regiment entirely as well, because they're effectively fighting on, for the Union side at least, the worst side of the war. So in the West, where they're not as effective, General Grant is kind of winning the war over in the East, and so the West is bloody, and they're probably not making a huge amount of ground, and there's losses, and they've got poor generals and commanders, as we've just heard. So it's an unpleasant place to be, and so it's remarkable that he survives. As talented as he clearly is, and as brave as he clearly is. In this type of war, and most wars, it's a lot of luck of, you just can get caught a bullet or get diarrhea again and then die. There's a million ways you can die in this war. So it's remarkable that he survives well in, so far into this war, and especially as he's fighting in, there's no good bit of the war, but you could say there's a worse side of the war as well, and the West was certainly that.
I also would just like to add, in Albert, even more molecular, they suffered terribly, because the 95th lost their colonel in the early part of that battle. Then he was replaced by the senior captain, William Stewart, who was himself shot, and then again Albert's own captain, who he was quite close to, E.N. Bush, was also killed. So the top three guys in the 95th died at the Battle of Bryce's Crossroads. So it would have been such not just a physical loss, but traumatic for the unit to lose so many important officers.
And he's involved in the battles of Spring Hill and Franklin, and they're successful. They're chasing Hood. But I just want to point out the 95th Illinois travelled 9,000 miles during the American Civil War. That is just absolutely staggering. Now, they do use rail at that point, but a lot of that will be marching. And I just can't even fathom that, I don't know what you guys think of that.
Oh, it's unbelievable. And I think also, just in terms of, if you look at Albert's life, the fact he was born into the greatest trauma to ever hit Ireland, that would have given him a steeliness to get through the hard times more than many of his comrades, because he's had to face so much, and whilst also being a man, but in a woman's body. You know, can you just imagine? He must have been made of the strongest stuff. And yeah, what do you think, Patrick?
It's a bit like, do you know and I don't know if it's actually true, but there's the story of a Japanese guy who somehow was in both Hiroshima and Nagasaki for both nuclear blasts, because Albert because you're right, he experiences the Great Famine in Ireland, which is probably one of, if not Ireland's most awful, horrendous time in its history, and then goes to America for what was arguably America's bloodiest, most awful time in history as well. I mean, I can't think of any other time in American history which is worse. I mean, civil wars always are terrible because it's just losses everywhere, and it's horrendous. So I think he is 2 for 2 in the two countries he lives in. He lives through possibly the worst time in their history, and has this, as you say, this extra secret that he has to put up with, and he has to protect himself. So it's a really hard life. So he must be made of titanium to get through all of this.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, but he does survive the war, and there is a post-life after that. So, Will, do you want to tell us a little bit about his post-war life after all of this horrible, horrible stuff that he must have witnessed and been through?
Yeah, of course. Well, as the war ended, he would have marched back to Belvedere, Illinois, and would have been received well by the locals, who were just thankful that some of them came back. There were 28% of his regiment did not come back. So there were 289 casualties of the war in the 95th. So to have survived was incredible. But I do think that Albert would have found it quite almost upsetting that he was mustered out, because basically you can't have thousands and thousands and thousands of volunteer troops still in arms, because it, first of all, would have been too expensive, and also you don't want a load of guys running around with guns. So he has to leave probably the closest bonds he makes in his entire life are his comrades in G Company, and suddenly he's back to where he would have started in Belvedere, and he didn't get an education. So he starts working as he had probably been working before, which was as a handyman. So he worked for a guy called Samuel Pepper in Belvedere, and then and stays in Belvedere originally before moving south in 1869, about 4 years later, and ended up in Saunamin, Livingston County, still in Illinois. And there he worked as a farmhand and a handyman for a family called the Chesbro family. And these guys were really, they took pity on Albert. I'm not sure if they ever knew who Albert was, his secret at all. But he started off by actually living in their shed, in their hardware shop, because he didn't have any money. He didn't know what he was going to do. But he managed to work with this family for 16 years. And on that, in that time, they actually built him a house, which he then lived in for the rest of his life, which is obviously, that's a nice part of the story. And he stayed in Saunamin for 40 years, and he worked all sorts of jobs, like he worked as a janitor, cemetery worker, and lamplighter. So it's just kind of interesting. The other thing that we have to remember is, because he was ostensibly a man, he was able to vote. So he would have voted in the elections post-war. I mean, we don't know that he did, because there aren't records of it, but there aren't records, those records aren't available really for anyone. So he would have been entitled to vote as a free man, and also entitled to an army pension. And that kicked in later, but until then he was reliant on the Chesbro family to keep him afloat.
Mm-hmm. Patrick?
Well, and this is where the story gets, it starts to take a bit of a turn. So in 1911, Al's doing quite well for himself, because he's now working for a state senator, a man named Ira Lish, and which is quite a big come up in the world. I think possibly as maybe as a mechanic, or as we've said, a handyman. But in 1911, he is somehow, it seems odd that it happens, but he's working for the state senator, and Senator Lish's car, when he's driving it, hits Al. So at something happens, he gets in the way and he runs over Al, and Al's leg is really badly broken. So he needs to be rushed to he needs to be rushed to the hospital, and the local surgery needs to start operating on him. And obviously, this is now the moment where he's spent so long, all throughout the entire war, he's managed to keep his secret by avoiding the field doctors and avoiding anyone really looking too closely at him. But he's unable to do that in this instant. And the doctors find out his secret, because obviously they need to examine, and they would take off presumably most of his clothes, and they would discover that Albert is biologically born a woman. However, at least for now, the senator, who's clearly racked with guilt and actually pays for all of Al's medical bills. So the senator and the doctor keep Al's secret, which is really remarkable at this time. This is, and it's, we'll probably get onto this towards the end, but, trans people today don't have it easy. But back then it would have been a huge scandal for it to find out. But obviously Al is such a likable guy and is so well trusted. I mean, he's trusted by a senator, that these two men, the senator and the doctor, are willing to keep his secret. But unfortunately, Al can no longer work because of his broken leg. He is now lame. He can't keep up where he is. I'm trying to think actually. So 1911. When's he born, Will? So how old is he at this time?
1843. So he's in his late 60s.
Yeah. Yes. So he's old guy at this point. He's probably getting towards the end of his working life anyway, but now with this injury he can no longer work. And so while at the moment his secret is still being held together just about, even though a senator and a doctor now know about it, he is now moved to the Soldiers and Sailors Care Home in Quincy on the 5th of May 1911. And the story doesn't get much better from here, sadly.
No. Okay. Will, do you want to add anything about that, or about the pension maybe?
Yeah, of course. So the pension, it's kind of interesting. So as Patrick just said, when he goes into the Soldiers and Sailors Care Home in Quincy, the discovery starts to leak out of this man or woman masquerading as a man, as the local newspapers would report it. And what was interesting about that was his pension as a Civil War veteran was suddenly, the government was like, hang on, is this someone trying to steal money? Is this a woman trying to steal money to get the pension from some other soldier somewhere? Maybe it would have been a brother or a husband, because they couldn't fathom that he'd actually served in the war, which I find kind of like, you can just imagine the 1911 sort of pension guy going, hang on, this is wrong. This is a woman. This cannot have been happening. So they launched an investigation into it, and this is where stuff starts to come out about him being Jennie Hodgers rather than Albert Cashier. But what's fantastic about this story is this could have ended really bleakly in terms of stripped of everything. And not saying it goes that much better, but the saving grace is that his comrades in arms from G Company, and you've got to remember, this is 1911. This is, 40, 50 years after the war. They come to his defense and go to the pension board and say, no, he was there. That's Albert Cashier. You might know him as Jennie Hodgers, but Al fought in the war, and he is eligible for this pension. And it sides with Albert. So Albert gets, I can even quote it. It says, the evidence secured in this case shows beyond any possible doubt that the pensioner is the person who rendered the service. Identity may be accepted. Now, that was the court ruling. And so he did keep his pension despite being outed as a woman.
Mm-hmm. And again, he's, a war hero, but yeah.
Absolutely.
Patrick, do you want to add anything about that?
Well, it's a really nice part of this, and it is kind of a sad, we'll get to more of it, but it is a kind of a sad ending. But what's so nice is that it does have this kind of beacon of hope in the fact that his fellow soldiers come to his defense. And as Will said, it's so long after, but the bonds you make in war. That sounds like it's about to be a quote, but I'm sure there are lots of quotes that are about the bonds you make in war. But it's all true because it really does bind people together. And the fact that these soldiers, these men who we don't know if any of them really knew, some of them may have suspected but didn't want to know, but they didn't care. They wanted to come to their brother-in-arms defense in this moment of need, and they wanted to make sure he was given everything he's due because he was a hero to them and he was a hero for this war, and they do not want to let his name be besmirched by some committee who's just trying to save some money. And you understand why people probably had to investigate it, because I'm sure there was a lot of mismanagement and people trying to get pension funds for things they didn't deserve, but he really did. And it's so nice to hear that in this time in history that there were soldiers willing to come and bat for him, because that would have also been hard for them. They could have been ostracized by their own communities for coming to support someone who their communities might have seen as taboo and people they don't want to associate with. So it's a really heroic effort. After all his heroism that he showed, it's so nice to see that his fellow soldiers show bravery as well, stand up to the government, ironically after fighting so hard to defend that government, and are willing to put their names and honor on the line for Albert.
Yeah, and I'll just add, the GAR, the Grand Army of the Republic, they did look after their comrades there in arms after the war. We had the same in London. We had the London branch of US Civil War veterans. They did the same thing. They formed an association to help a lot of these guys because they enlisted in different names, and so they had similar problems getting their pensions. And this organisation, the GAR, helped a lot of their comrades out, and that was the point of having them. But again, they'd been through something so horrendous, they are going to come to each other's aids, because they did back then, didn't they? But there is a sad end on October the 10th, 1915. He is buried, isn't he? So tell us about his death and the sad end, Will.
Well, so at Quincy, he seemed very happy at the care home, but then he is interviewed by a Catholic priest, and this Catholic priest, once he finds out that Albert is in fact a woman by birth, is done with this, and he says, no, you should not be here, and instead gets him transferred to what was then an insane asylum at Watertown. And this is so ironic in that it was probably an Irish Catholic priest, and he started his life in Ireland, and it's the Irish that pulls him back away from this life that he'd been living for his entire life as a man. He never was seen in a dress until they get to the insane asylum and they strip him and put him into a dress and make him dress as a woman. And he would struggle against this, but there was nothing. He was suffering from dementia by this point, and he'd obviously got a lame leg now from the being hit by Ira Lish's car. And so whilst he's at that hospital, some of his friends come and visit, and they say that he is just a frail woman of 70 who is broken and is also very awkward in women's clothes. And one day he trips over his dress and he never really recovers. So he hurts his hip and then he fades away and dies. And what's so sad about that is he clearly, if your brain is already, we don't know how onset the dementia was, but he was probably really confused because he was wearing clothes which he'd never worn before. And anyway, and it all was because of a Catholic priest, which I just think is a horrible twist in that tale. But there is an interesting ending to this tale. I'll leave it to Patrick to seal the deal with this one.
Okay.
Yes, and it's a really, again, it's a little beacon of light in an otherwise quite dark end to Albert, in that after he passes away, his brothers in arms, his comrades, come to his defense again because they petition for Albert to be buried in his uniform, which was granted, and he's buried with a United States flag draped over his coffin and with full military honors. So despite this sad final chapter where he's mistreated and forced back into the clothes and the life of someone who he isn't at all at this point by a, as you say, ironically, a Catholic priest. After he passes away, that kind of anger and hate and prejudice that kind of corrupted the final moments of his life vanishes, and all that remains is the hero that he was and that the impact he made on his brothers in arms, who ensure that he is properly honoured when he dies.
Excellent. Well, thank you for telling his story. But so the question's going to be now, Will, when did you first discover Albert's story, and what sort of things were out there to help you piece some of this together for yourselves and for your episode of the podcast that you did between the two of you?
Well, I came across this story actually a really long time, well, not I said, years and years ago. I had my own podcast, which never actually saw the light of day, but I was still at university, or I was still in touch with my university professors, and I was asking, are there any tales that I should be looking into? And one such professor said to me, have you heard of Albert? I don't know much about him, but I've got a PhD student writing a thesis on him at the moment. And I was like, oh no. So I looked into him and I started finding this story. Now today, when you go online, I'm thankful to say that there's far more about him online. But when I first started looking into it, there wasn't that much. So I relied quite heavily on a book called Albert and Jennie, A Civil War Story by Greg Romanek. And that book was fantastic because I read it cover to cover several times, and I just thought it was fantastic, and it gave me an insight into who he was. And there was a lot of testimony that we had because of the pension fiasco that was going on. There's quite a lot of detail in the thing. So I started looking into it as a researcher as well as a podcaster, and I looked at the old documents and I started piecing together the story that way. But yeah, I'm just so happy that his story, he's becoming more and more embedded into the main story where he should be, and also can hopefully be an inspiration to people who are looking for trans heroes from the past, because they are normally written out of history. He's very unusual in that he is actually in there, and he's being put out of it. So yeah, that's how I came to it. And I did the research because on our podcast, each episode we present to each other. So Patrick had no idea about Albert until I presented it to him, and whenever he's doing a podcast episode, I don't know anything he's going to bring up.
Oh, awesome. So okay, yeah, so he didn't know nothing until your episode then, basically nothing at all.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh wow, that's interesting. That's really throwing you under the bus, isn't it, Patrick? But yeah, so how was that for you when you obviously, I know I've listened to the episode, it's fantastic. Guys, go and listen to it. I'll put a link in the podcast description. But so what was it like for you learning his story for the first time, Patrick?
I mean, it's just mind-blowing, really. I mean, we always try and find stories where, you know, there's many stages to it, and you know, we try and find dramatic stories, and you know, there's lots of twists and turns, but this story is just blows your mind. And I think what's really fascinating about it is because it is a window into history that we don't normally get, and is normally hidden away from us even nowadays. And you know, in the space of time of Will first finding out about it to us recording it a second time, or doing it on our podcast, and even to now, the amount of knowledge and the amount of sharing of Albert's story has grown and grown, because it is just such a part of history that's hidden away and not talked about. And it's brilliant, the fact that we talk about it now, because actually I think there's a lot of trans history that's kind of thrown under the rug. There's a lot of, you know, politics today, which means people kind of want to forget about the fact that trans people have been a part of our culture and most cultures throughout our entire history. And so it's just an incredible story. And it's just so nice to hear. It's always good to have a little bit where it gets to a point where the system is putting a good man down, but his brothers in arms come and help him out. You know, it's got it's got a bit of a feel-good ending. Obviously, it's got a bit of a tragic ending as well, but it's nice to have the final bit to be positive with his brothers in arms, ensuring he gets full military honors. So it blew me away when I heard it. It also slightly annoyed me because it's better than any episode I've done. It's definitely, I think, one of our best ones.
So we're going to get onto your podcast in a minute, but I'm just saying, Hollywood, if you're listening, come on, get a TV show made of this. But anyway, yeah, 100%. Imagine how good that would be. But you'd probably be screaming because it would be inaccurate. But anyway, I won't get into that. So let's talk about the Cloak and Dagger podcast. Now, I know, Will, you said at the beginning that you already had a podcast, or you said that just a minute ago, and then you met each other at uni, and so who was it that instigated, right, come on, let's do a podcast, let's talk about what we love and do it and share it with everyone else,
frankly, we came out of it because of the pandemic. So at the time, Patrick was living in Manchester and I was living in London, and I had tried to do a podcast. It hadn't really worked, but I knew I wanted to do something. And me and Patrick are absolutely best mates. And we weren't, it was a very difficult time, and we were trying to work out how we'd keep in touch. And I was like, okay, I'm going to pitch it to him and I'll just see what he says. And I remember that phone call really well. I actually did it in this exact room, and I called him and he was straight away like, yeah, that could work. Let's have a go. And then from there, we had no real experience, but because it was the pandemic, I had lots of time on my hands. So I did all the research into sort of the gear that we use and the rigs and everything. And then I'd also come from a background in media. I worked in TV, history documentaries, BBC and that sort of thing. So I was used to the producing content was something I was doing anyway. And Patrick, bless him, he was so on it. And he took my idea and then just elevated it. And together we built it organically. Wouldn't you say, Patrick?
Yeah. It's kind of, we've really figured it out as we've gone along. I mean, people have said that, and I do every now and again, I think we should remove those first episodes because the quality of the recording is good. We're all over the place. We used to, in our first series, because we used to do it as set series, like a 6 episode run. And the first time we did every single episode, we did it once before and then recorded it for real because we weren't sure if we would be able to do it properly, which was such a huge waste of time, but it probably did help a little bit. But we also, because our first series, our first two series, actually, the episode was, the podcast was very focused on historical assassinations. And mainly because we both played Assassin's Creed when we were younger and we wanted a bit of focus, and that's where the name of the Cloak and Dagger podcast came out of it. So we wanted to kind of focus in on that. But we realized that it's a bit restricting in a way to just focus on that kind of thing. And you actually realize most assassinations just turn out to be annoyed nobles who are annoyed that the king or the emperor or whoever isn't quite doing what they want, so they stab him and get a new one. So we decided to open it up, and we now do episodes on all sorts of weird and unusual historical stories that we try and find ones where they're not as well known, and we try to bring out new stories like this one here, where it's kind of flown under the radar and not as many people know about it as they maybe should. So we try and find stories like that, and it's just, I think it's got better and better, mainly because we're more used to it and we've got better equipment now. And now we come on other people's podcasts.
There you go. Great. Yeah, so I would say to you guys, I started during COVID as well. I made a leap of faith and contacted someone from Emerging Civil War, and I'm sitting here now with you guys on here. My first few episodes I cringe at, and I'm like, but you know what? They're staying on there because that's how you start. I didn't have a clue at editing. I had to get my wife to edit my first video. I had no idea. I'm all right now, thankfully, but it was tough, but it's fantastic, and so I just want to bring your Instagram page into it because you have a fantastic Instagram page. So who's responsible? Do you both sort of like take a hit on that and get involved in that?
No, that's all Will. I mean, we both create posts, but it's you run the Instagram.
I do. I run our social media, but the grid that we do, so the 3 posts per episode, that is Patrick, and he actually designed the
it's
square.
Actually not. It's not me. It's my wife.
Oh,
It was
yes,
Meg
your wife.
who suggested it. So she works in PR, so thought it would be a good idea to have a really clear structure, and it looks all elegant. It's been slightly messed up because Instagram have changed the ratio of the grid, which has annoyed me to no end because it ruins all of our old posts. But yeah, that's where that came out. But yeah, it's Will that runs it. Will speaks to lots of the people who get in touch if they want to ask questions or if they want to point out any historical or anything we got wrong, which I don't think has come up that much, but
No,
slightly
a few
on the lookout
times,
for that.
but not always. And then also, I'm the kind of booking agent, so this is how me and Daz have met, was through Instagram. So I've got quite a few. We've done quite a few guest episodes on other ones like A Little History Podcast and Jammy History Podcast and the History of England podcast. So we like to spread around and do the guest episodes because it's great, because it's a community, right? It's important.
Yeah, and I love the history community. It's fantastic, especially on Instagram. It's such a nice place to be. I find some other platforms are not as nice as others. But anyway, so yeah, honestly, guys, fantastic. So if people want to find your podcast, where do they go and find it?
Actually,
So they can find on basically all podcast catchers, the Cloak and Dagger podcast. I think there was there's another podcast that's about an old TV show that technically we compete with, but I think that ended a while ago. So yeah, Spotify, Apple Music, iTunes, Google Podcasts. I think they're done actually now, Google Podcasts. But yeah, anywhere you can get a podcast, you can find us. And then our Instagram is at Cloak and Dagger Podcast. So you can find out all of and we put a lot of extra content on there. Like, I mean, I'm quite jealous of this slideshow that you have here, but we put all of our like images and photos and maps and things on there, so you can get a bit more extra content when you're listening to our episodes.
Well, brilliant. Honestly, thank you for coming on and telling Albert's story, both of you. I really appreciate it.
no, it's our
Thank you for
pleasure.
letting
Thank you
us.
so much. It's been an absolute pleasure being on here.
All that is left to say, ladies and gentlemen, is cheers.
Cheers.